to feel a little more safe in that community. Well, the police ministry, and we'll stay with the theme around the statistics around crime, the police ministry revealing that arguments, misunderstandings, road rage are among the leading causes of murder, attempted murder and assault GBH in South Africa. You might have heard that news conference. We carried it on Newzroom, the ministry releasing the third quarter crime statistics, which cover the period between the 1st of October to the 31st of December. You have factors or crime categories like robbery, vigilantism or mob justice also listed as the main drivers of murder in South Africa. So we wanted to talk about our collective psychology and what are some of these causation factors, what's driving them, what are the reasons we have these things then bleeding into our interactions with others and driving up our murder numbers. Clinical psychologist Barry Viljoen joins us in our studio to talk about this. Barry, good morning. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a subject you know well. You've presented papers overseas. Yes. It's a subject you delve in and you understand quite closely. You also work in the corrective and rehabilitation spaces as well.
Correct, yes.
So I think when I heard that, you just think that's such a senseless thing. I mean, we've all had incidents where we might have been prone to road rage. Once we allow the chemicals to calm down and just, redirect our attention, we think, oh, I'm so glad I didn't react to that in the way that I planned to. So we regret things after they've happened.
For sure.
Share with us what you know about the factors that have been outlined and what some of the drivers of these types of behaviors are.
So I think the first thing we need to look at is when we look at the stats that the vast majority of these incidents occur over weekends. 75% of these unplanned murders are linked to alcohol and drug use, according to the dockets. We know that it's 20 to 29-year-olds who are the most likely to be affected, both as victims and perpetrators, and that this is occurring between 6 to midnight during the weekends. So like most crimes in South Africa, we know that there's a massive link between alcohol and substance use. And as you said, the ability to manage ourselves when we're intoxicated significantly reduces. Also with that population, if we think about the brain function and the brain development, the fact is that it's not fully formed in terms of our frontal lobe for the vast majority. So you can think of all those factors coming together, plus historically a very violent society, and I think as we saw in the previous pieces, the fact that the value of life often is seen as not having huge amounts of value. It's a perfect storm coming together, right?
Barry, you've said so much rich stuff in there. Some of these factors we've talked about before. For example, we talk about our national pathology in a post-apartheid context, 100%. The violence that we come from and what is really embedded. I know there's some research on hereditary trauma and so on. I know that it's a disputed territory, but it certainly is a factor that we think about. I want to home in on some of these things that you've just said because it will help us to manage ourselves going forward. 75% unplanned murders. In other words, you didn't go out deciding that tonight I'm going to kill someone.
Yes.
So this is it's not premeditated.
100%, yeah.
But what's driving it are drugs and alcohol. Let's just home in on that territory for a moment. And I think the developmental piece around the prefrontal lobe, just our human brain development, just talk to us in a bit more detail about the connection between those two
So I
things.
think the reality is our frontal lobe, which is generally affected by prefrontal cortex, is how we manage emotions, exactly like what you're talking about earlier. I'm really glad I didn't act in that way. And we know that anger can be broken down into 4 kind of components historically, which is the emotional, the cognitive, and then of course physical action and then verbal action. Right, so again, our ability to self-regulate is linked to that prefrontal cortex, which develops and generally finishes developing around the age of 25. Males slightly slower than females, historically. And then, of course, we're not assuming with things like early alcohol or substance use, which we know in South Africa is approximately 14% higher with substance use than the average for internationally. And also, if we think about alcohol use, and specifically binge drinking, if we think about weekends, I think we're one of the #1 countries, if not the #1 in the world.
Okay, so we'll talk about self-regulation and some of the tactics that we can employ when we're in the car, or in a nightclub, or we're in a tavern, or in a social setting in just a moment. I want to talk a little bit more about the triggers then, and why it is so, it becomes more activated and kind of at higher risk for triggering. What is the compromise that happens when we are under the influence of drugs and alcohol?
So if we think about it, what it's going to do let's use alcohol as one. Before, illicit substances obviously can be quite different depending which ones we're using. But what it is going to do is going to reduce our inhibition. It's going to reduce the function of our prefrontal cortex. So imagine, in essence, it's like driving your car, but the brake's not working 100%, or sometimes not working at all. So very easy for us to accelerate really, really fast, and then also for us to not be able to stop ourselves. So you said ability to self-regulate. So women generally are better at self-regulating than men. So it takes a lot longer for women to get angry.
Why is that?
So I think there's a lot of biological components. The studies are showing the fact that it's got to do with women generally have a higher blood pressure rate than men, but men's goes a lot quicker and faster. And I think it's got to do also with, besides the biology, the socialization. If we think about, you spoke about some of our historical challenges in this country, we're thinking about a very patriarchal society, we're thinking about a society where violence or aggression is often celebrated. If we think about just the effects of social media, about how men should behave, how women should behave, how we're conditioned, those are big things as well. So I think one of the points you made earlier as well was, how do we manage ourselves? So the reality is that the question we have to ask ourselves is, what insult is worth my life changing significantly by actually killing someone or hurting someone to that extent? And my thought is very few. Self-defense, I think, if I understand the stats correctly, only makes up about 2% of those unplanned murders, which is also a very difficult thing for, how do we police that? So we know the fact that, and I think we've seen it in the news on several occasions, that our liquor industry isn't as well policed as it should be. If we're thinking about illegal taverns, if we're thinking about illegal drinking, underage drinking as well, these are all big challenges that South Africa faces, which you said links to some of our past in terms of poverty, in terms of social disparity, in terms of unemployment, in terms of probably frustration, and several other social ills as well.
In 1,453 lives just cut down, no longer there, is a huge percent. I mean, it's a huge portion of the 6,953. Sure. These are things.
It's a frightening number, actually.
Exactly, that you're sharing with us are actually avoidable. When you said, so there are two things. One is how we have to re-socialize ourselves and prepare ourselves, I guess, for when we go out. Because once we're under the influence or compromised through drugs or alcohol, we're not going to be making sensible decisions. As you said, the brakes are no longer working. It then presupposes, Barry, that we need to do that preparatory work before we even go into a social setting. We need to make this agreement with ourselves and with our friends that under no circumstances are we going to be triggered. How does one do that work of reprogramming one's mind?
So I think that for each person is going to be a little bit different, and I think that's where therapies are very helpful to get to understand ourselves and our triggers and what our needs are. I think the other reality is that we are probably the second most stressed nation in the world, behind Nigeria, according to the statistics. And I think one of the big challenges we don't have as a society healthy ways to let off steam. And I say healthy because a lot of the time, how do we let off steam? We go for a drink and we get involved in often destructive kind of recreational activities, as opposed to constructive ones which aren't going to get us into trouble. So I think that's also a big thing of, how do I manage my frustration? So if you're already going with, say, 75% of your frustration level there, you then add a little bit of alcohol, maybe something else to it, and then someone insults you, already we're going to explode, we're going to boil over. So how do we get to the point that we release the steam before? Is it through sports? Is it through self-reflection? Is it through other ways? Meditation, for example, for some people will be very helpful.
One of the things that I do, because I call it about, and I mean, I'm not an expert, just a little hack for myself, is about getting back to zero.
Yes.
Is if in traffic, there's a propensity for you to go to 1 and a 2 because you're irritated with someone, and then building that exponentially through the day. It's at each point to neutralize that asset and keep getting back to zero. But it is something you have to be aware of and something you have to think about. What else can people do in a situation now where tensions are heightened?
So look, I think the reality is what one can do the best is to try and delay as much time between us acting and what has happened. So we actually use our brains, right? Yeah. Because if we just respond, often we're not using our brain. We're just responding normally in an aggressive manner, as opposed to taking a breath, stepping away, thinking, okay, sure, you said that wasn't great, but how is it going to solve the situation? By you insulting me and me insulting you, things are just going to escalate. It's not going to downgrade the situation. So sometimes just as simple as walking away. What you're talking about, there's also a fantastic technique called cognitive diffusion, which is a nice way to work through each of those emotions, slowly releasing that pressure. So like you said, traffic, someone's cut me off, I'm really upset, I'm frustrated. I think I sit with those emotions, I let them go, so that the next moment when someone does something else, it doesn't just build on that. And then maybe I lash out at a loved one or my child when I go home or something like that.
Yeah,
which I think we're all guilty of, right, at some point.
Because sometimes you're making someone pay the bill for something that they weren't responsible for. Yeah. You're angry in your relationship, in your job, and it's all just building up, and it takes one little trigger and you're reacting with everything.
Beautifully said. And I think a lot of the time we see people lashing out in spaces where I just lost it. And why? If you really reflect, it's like you said, a build-up of 1, 2, 3, 4, and a small little thing, the straw that broke the camel's back, is where it gets an unwarranted amount of frustration from us.
All right, we really need to damp things. We need to damp things down, as you say, and be engaged in things that are a little calmer and allow us to, as you say, diffuse that tension or release the pressure. Thank you, Barry, so much for coming in. Really appreciate your time and your perspective this morning. Clinical psychologist Barry Viljoen, just reflecting on those crime statistics where we're talking about the causative factors. A large number of people are dying over arguments and over road rage.